Imagine if aliens landed on Earth tomorrow and started carving up your neighborhood with rulers, giving your house to someone from Mars and your backyard to someone from Jupiter, all without asking you. That's essentially what happened in 1884 when European powers gathered in Berlin to slice up Africa like a birthday cake, except nobody invited the birthday boy. The Berlin Conference read like a who's who of European imperialism, hosted by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who was basically the ultimate political chess master of his era. Bismarck wasn't even that interested in African colonies initially. He was more concerned with keeping European powers from killing each other over African territories and disrupting his carefully balanced European political system. Britain showed up as the reigning champion of colonialism, already controlling crucial territories like Egypt and South Africa. They were the kids who already had the best toys and didn't want anyone else playing with them. France arrived with grand ambitions, dreaming of a colonial empire stretching from west to east across the entire continent. Portugal, despite being a relatively small European power, came with big claims based on their centuries-old coastal trading posts. Belgium's King Leopold II was perhaps the most sinister player, presenting himself as a humanitarian while secretly planning to turn the Congo into his personal money-making machine. Italy, Germany, Spain, the Netherlands, Austria-Hungary, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and even the United States all sent representatives to grab their piece of the pie. The irony? The continent they were dividing up had more diversity than all of Europe combined, yet somehow Europe felt qualified to reorganize it. By the 1880s, Europe had developed serious colonial FOMO, fear of missing out on African resources. The Industrial Revolution had created an insatiable hunger for raw materials, and Africa was like a giant, unopened treasure chest. The discovery of diamonds in South Africa in 1867 and gold in 1886 had European investors seeing dollar signs. Meanwhile, explorers like Henry Morton Stanley were sending back reports that made the Congo River basin sound like the Amazon of Africa. European powers were getting increasingly paranoid about each other. Britain worried France might block their route to India. France was concerned about British dominance. Germany wanted to prove it could play the colonial game too. Africa became the chessboard where they decided to work out their issues. The immediate trigger for the conference was a dispute over the Congo River. Both Britain and France had competing claims, and Leopold II of Belgium was quietly maneuvering to grab the whole region for himself. Rather than let this spiral into a European war, Bismarck proposed they all sit down and figure out some ground rules for dividing Africa peacefully. The Berlin Conference established what they called the principle of effective occupation, which sounds very official, but was basically a fancy way of saying finders keepers, but you have to prove you actually found it. Under these rules, European powers couldn't just point at a map and claim territory. They had to demonstrate effective occupation through treaties with local rulers, establishing administrative systems, or maintaining a military presence. This sounds reasonable until you realize that treaties often meant showing up with guns and getting signatures from chiefs who couldn't read the documents they were signing. The conference also established spheres of influence, allowing European powers to claim exclusive economic rights in specific regions. They created rules about river navigation, declaring the Congo and Niger rivers free trade zones, supposedly about promoting commerce, but really meaning European powers could move goods and troops freely while locals lost control. Perhaps most cynically, they wrapped everything in humanitarian language, claiming they were bringing civilization and ending slavery while planning brutal exploitation schemes. The actual border-drawing process was shockingly casual for something that would affect millions of lives for generations. European diplomats used maps that were often wildly inaccurate, filled with blank spaces marked unexplored or territory of unknown tribes. They drew straight lines across deserts, through mountains, and across rivers with rulers and pencils, creating borders that made perfect sense in a Berlin conference room, but were completely divorced from African realities. The Sahara Desert was divided between French and British spheres, splitting nomadic tribes who had traveled these routes for centuries. In West Africa, they created a jigsaw puzzle that defied logic. The Gambia became a tiny British sliver, completely surrounded by French Senegal. Imagine if Canada claimed a strip through the middle of Texas. The most tragic examples involved splitting unified kingdoms. The Yoruba people were divided between British Nigeria and French Dahomey. The Hausa found themselves separated by colonial borders. The Bakongo kingdom was split between 3 different European territories. European powers were so focused on their own competition that they paid no attention to existing African political structures. The sophisticated kingdom of Buganda was absorbed into British Uganda. The Ashanti Empire found itself incorporated into British Gold Coast. Powerful states like the Sokoto Caliphate were divided between British and French territories. The most stunning aspect of the Berlin Conference was the complete absence of African representation. This wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate choice that revealed everything about European attitudes toward Africa. The European powers operated under the assumption that African societies were primitive and therefore couldn't participate in civilized diplomatic negotiations. This was convenient fiction that ignored the reality of sophisticated African kingdoms, complex political systems, and extensive trade networks that had existed for centuries. Ethiopia, which had successfully resisted Italian colonization and maintained its independence, wasn't invited despite being a functioning sovereign state with international diplomatic relations. The Ashanti Empire, which had been negotiating treaties with Europeans for decades, was excluded. The Sokoto Caliphate, with its complex administrative system and written constitution, was ignored. African leaders learned about the conference decisions through European colonial administrators who arrived to implement the new borders. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that foreign powers had decided your neighborhood now belonged to someone else, and you had no say in the matter. Some African leaders tried to resist these imposed borders through diplomacy and warfare, but they were fighting against a coordinated European system that had already divided their territories and allocated resources for conquest. The superior European military technology, combined with the coordination achieved at Berlin, made resistance incredibly difficult. The borders created in Berlin weren't just lines on paper, they became concrete barriers that would shape African politics for over a century. Colonial powers invested heavily in making these artificial borders feel real through military posts, customs stations, and administrative systems. Different colonial powers imposed different languages, legal systems, and economic structures on their territories. French colonies were integrated into the French economic system and taught French language and culture. British colonies followed British legal traditions and used English as the administrative language. German colonies developed their own separate systems before being redistributed after World War I. These differences created lasting divisions between neighboring African communities. Villages that had traded freely for generations suddenly found themselves in different countries with different currencies, languages, and laws. Families were separated by borders they couldn't legally cross without permits. The economic impact was devastating. Colonial borders were designed to facilitate the extraction of resources to Europe, not to promote inter-African trade. Railways ran from resource-rich interior regions to coastal ports, not between African territories. This pattern of economic extraction became deeply embedded in colonial infrastructure. Colonial powers also manipulated ethnic and religious differences to maintain control. They favored certain groups over others, creating artificial hierarchies that would later fuel conflicts. In Rwanda, Belgian colonial authorities emphasized differences between Hutu and Tutsi populations that had previously been more fluid social categories. Walk into any African Union meeting today, and you'll see the ghost of the Berlin Conference sitting at every table. Most African countries still have the same borders that were drawn in European conference rooms over 140 years ago. These borders continue to create practical problems. Niger, Chad, and Mali struggle with security challenges partly because their borders cut across traditional nomadic routes, making it difficult to control movement and trade. The Sahel region's instability is partly rooted in borders that ignore traditional political and economic relationships. Economic integration remains challenging because colonial borders were designed to connect African territories to European markets, not to each other. Countries like Chad and Central African Republic are still more economically connected to France than to their African neighbors. Railway networks built during colonial periods still run from interior mining regions to coastal ports, rather than connecting African cities to each other. Language barriers created by colonial rule continue to divide the continent. African Union meetings require translation between English, French, Portuguese, Arabic, and indigenous languages. Regional economic communities like ECOWAS struggle with integration because member countries have different colonial languages and legal systems. The most tragic legacy is the way artificial borders have fueled conflicts. Civil wars in Congo, Sudan, and other African countries often have roots in colonial border drawing that forced different ethnic and political groups into the same territories while separating unified communities. However, African leaders have largely chosen to maintain colonial borders rather than redraw them, recognizing that changing borders now would likely create more conflicts than it would solve. The Organization of African Unity, founded in 1963, explicitly committed to respecting colonial borders to prevent continental chaos. The Berlin Conference represents one of the most successful diplomatic heists in human history. 14 European nations and the United States managed to claim ownership of an entire continent without firing a shot at each other. But this success came at the cost of centuries of African political development and millions of African lives. The conference established precedents for international relations that we're still dealing with today. The idea that powerful nations can redraw borders and reorganize societies without consulting the people who live there didn't end in 1884. We've seen echoes of this approach in the aftermath of World War I, the Cold War, and even in contemporary international interventions. If this deep dive into how Europe literally played risk with Africa opened your eyes to the roots of modern geopolitics, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories about how historical events still shape our world today.